In the autumn of 1843, in a drainage trench along the edge of a canal project in southern Ohio, workers pulled something out of the clay that stopped a project engineer from writing in his journal for 11 days. Not slowed him down, not distracted him, stopped him completely. 11 days of silence from a man whose field journals are otherwise so meticulous they record timber shipment delays and daily weather observations with the consistency of a Swiss clock. And then, on the 12th day, he resumed. Not with a description of what they had found, not with measurements or sketches or the kind of cautious excitement you would expect from a man who had just witnessed something extraordinary pulled from the American earth. He wrote about the weather. He wrote about the canal bank. He noted a late timber delivery. The object was never mentioned again, not once, in any surviving document connected to that project. And that silence, that specific shaped, deliberate silence, is where this story actually begins. Not with the object itself, with what it did to the people who encountered it. Because here is what they found: a circular stone mechanism approximately 4 feet in diameter, divided into concentric rings, each etched with markings that bore no clean resemblance to any known writing system of the region. Not a carving, not a petroglyph. A mechanism with layered discs and internal structure suggesting moving parts, or at minimum the intention of moving parts. The mineral composition of the stone did not match local geology. The tolerances between the rings, measurable from surviving sketches, were consistent across the entire disc, to a degree that implied tools or techniques that have never been formally accounted for. And the innermost ring, the smallest and most finely worked of all, did not loop. It did not repeat. It terminated. At a fixed, specific, non-recurring point that independent researchers in the late 20th century, working from 2 separate methodological approaches, calculated to fall somewhere in the early years of the 4th decade of the 21st century. Neither calculation extends past 2030. I need you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further, because the instinct when you hear a claim like that is to reach immediately for a debunking framework, and I understand that instinct completely. It is the right instinct, but I want you to notice something. The debunking framework assumes we are dealing with a prediction. It assumes someone in the distant past looked forward through time and inscribed a date they could not have known. And that is a strange assumption, because there is another possibility. A possibility that I think is considerably more unsettling. What if the wheel does not predict 2030? What if it remembers it? Those are not the same thing. And the difference between them is the question this investigation refuses to let go of. Let me tell you about the engineer first, because his 11 days of silence are the most honest piece of documentation we have, and I think we have been reading them wrong. The standard interpretation, when anyone bothers to acknowledge them at all, is that he was disturbed, unsettled by something anomalous he could not explain, that he chose professional silence over professional embarrassment. And maybe that is part of it, but the deeper I went into what little survives from this period, the more I became convinced that something else was also happening in those 11 days, something closer to comprehension than confusion. The man understood something, not everything, but enough. Enough that when he returned to his journal, he chose not to record it. Chose deliberately, because some doors, once documented, cannot be undocumented. The county newspaper from November of that year ran 2 sentences about an unusual geological formation discovered near the canal works. The following week's edition carried a correction. The formation, the correction stated, had been reassessed by competent authority and found to be of natural origin. No name was attached to that authority. No explanation was offered for what natural geological process produces a 4-foot disk of worked stone, digging it into mathematically precise concentric rings. The correction does not explain anything. It closes a door. That is its only function. And the official explanation collapses here so quietly you almost miss it, which I suspect was the intention. The photographs existed. I want to be precise about this because the temptation when discussing lost documentation is to speak loosely, and I do not want to do that here. The photographs existed. They are referenced in letters. They are mentioned in the margins of academic correspondence as depicting an artifact of uncertain provenance recovered from the canal works. A regional antiquarian publication noted them once. And then they are gone, not cataloged in an archive under the wrong heading, not where deteriorated from chemical exposure or flood damage with the kind of documentary trail that actual archival loss produces. Gone in the specific way that things go when someone has made a decision about them. What remains are fragments. Enough to confirm that something circular was photographed, enough to see the suggestion of concentric markings along an edge, not enough to settle any question definitively, which I have come to believe is precisely the amount that was meant to remain. Once you see the shape of that, you cannot unsee it. Not nothing, not everything, just enough to keep the question alive without ever allowing it to be answered. That is not accidental erasure. That is calibrated erasure. And calibrated erasure requires someone at the calibration point who understood what they were calibrating for. Here is where the suppression becomes more interesting than the object itself. Because the suppression did not happen once, it happened repeatedly across decades, performed by people who had no apparent connection to one another and no obvious reason to coordinate their silence. The engineer stops writing. The newspaper prints a correction with no named source. The photographs largely disappear. A private letter references the sketches, and then the letter itself changes hands 3 times and becomes inaccessible to researchers. An astronomer in the 1970s is shown reproductions of the surviving drawings, describes what he sees as either a remarkable coincidence or evidence of systematic observation spanning generations, and publishes nothing. His correspondence on the subject is held in a private collection not currently accessible. Archival requests made in recent years have been denied on grounds that were charitably unusual. One institution acknowledged the existence of a relevant file and then stated in a follow-up communication that no such file had been located. This raises a simple but critical question. How does the same response repeat itself across 180 years without explicit coordination? The answer, I think, is that it does not require explicit coordination. It requires a habit so old and so thoroughly embedded in the institutions that handle anomalous findings that it operates below the level of conscious decision. People encounter this story, grasp something of its implications, and set it down. Not debunk it, not investigate it fully. Set it down and walk away, as if they understood without being told that some things are better left where they were found. That habit, reliable and repeating across generations, is itself a form of data. And I find I cannot stop thinking about what it means that the habit is stronger than the curiosity. Now I want to talk about the mechanism itself. Because even stripped entirely of its implications, even considered as a pure object with no calendar function and no terminus date, it is extraordinary in ways that the official silence does not adequately account for. The stone was not local. Mineral analysis places its origin somewhere between the upper Great Lakes and, in the most conservative reading, significantly further than that. The surface working is, by any honest assessment, of a precision that implies either tools we have not accounted for, or a process of refinement so patient and systematic that it reorganizes everything we think we know about pre-contact craft in the region. The concentric rings are not decorative approximations. They are calibrated. The gaps between them, where measurable, hold to tolerances that a practicing engineer looking at the sketches is described as more consistent than he would expect from hand tools. The markings within the rings are internally coherent. Every specialist who has been shown reproductions, working independently, in different disciplines, across different decades, arrives at the same conclusion. There is a grammar to them. The symbols obey rules. The tradition they belong to is simply one that nobody has successfully identified. And that is the strangest part of the object's intellectual history. Not that it defies explanation, but that it defies origin. Comparisons have been drawn to symbol sets from across the ancient world, and every comparison holds just enough to be tantalizing and breaks down just enough to be inconclusive. As if the markings belong to a tradition that either influenced everything else or was influenced by all of it, or predates the distinctions we use to separate ancient cultures from one another. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The closer you look, the less it fits any single category, and the less it fits, the more significant that becomes. I want to stay with the calendar function now, because this is where the philosophical weight of the thing begins to press down in a way that I think demands careful handling. Every timekeeping system I have ever studied, every cyclical calendar from every culture that has produced one, is built around the fundamental premise of repetition. The cycle completes and begins again. The year turns, the moon returns, the wheel spins. That is what a wheel is for. That is the entire structural logic of circular timekeeping. A calendar that does not loop is not a calendar. It is something else. And what it is, I keep returning to this, what it is depends entirely on the direction you are reading it from. If you are reading it forward, it is a countdown. It tells you how much time remains before something. If you are reading it backward, it is a record. It tells you how long ago something happened, and it marks the moment when that something will come around again, because it has come around before. And that distinction, prediction, or memory is not a philosophical nicety. It changes the nature of the object completely. A prediction requires a prophet, someone with access to future knowledge, supernatural or technological, who inscribed what they saw coming into stone so that those who came after would know to expect it. That is a remarkable thing to claim, and it is the claim most people assume is being made when they encounter a story like this one. But a memory requires something different. A memory requires experience. It requires that whoever built this object had already lived through whatever the terminus marks, that they were not looking forward at something approaching. They were looking backward at something they had survived, or had not survived, and leaving a marker for whoever came next. Leaving a marker that said, roughly, this is when it happens. This is the window. We know because we were there. Those are not the same claim. And the second one is considerably harder to dismiss because it does not require us to believe in prophecy. It requires us to believe in history, history that did not survive, history that was either lost or removed or buried under enough sediment and silence that we have no access to it now. History that someone thought important enough to encode in, worked stone precise enough to last the distance. The evidence suggests something much larger than one eccentric object in one Ohio drainage trench. The evidence suggests a pattern of termination that appears across ancient timekeeping systems in cultures with no documented contact. The Maya built the most precisely engineered calendar system ever produced by a pre-industrial civilization, and it too encoded a termination point. We misread it, publicly and somewhat embarrassingly, as an apocalypse prediction for 2012. And when December 22nd of that year arrived unremarkably, we dismissed the entire subject and moved on. But we were asking the wrong question. The question was never, what ends? The question was, why did so many separate civilizations, working in isolation from one another, keep building timekeeping systems with endpoints? Why does the wheel keep stopping, in culture after culture, in system after system, across thousands of years of independent astronomical observation? What did they all understand about time that our current frameworks refuse to accommodate? A wheel that is built to stop is not measuring time. It is measuring something else, something with a shape, a beginning and an end, something that can be survived and remembered and encoded for the next people who arrive at the same coordinates in the cycle. And if that is what these objects are, not prophecy but warning, not prediction but instruction, then the question is not whether someone knew 2030 was coming. The question is whether they had already been there. I spent a long time sitting with the engineer's journal, specifically with the 11 days that are not there. I kept asking myself what he understood in that silence that he could not bring himself to write down. And the answer I kept arriving at is this. He understood that the object was not from his past. It was from ours. He did not have the framework to articulate that. The conceptual vocabulary for thinking about cyclical civilizational time did not exist in the form he would have needed to use it. But I think he felt the shape of it. I think he pulled something out of the clay that told him, without words, without translation, that it had been waiting. Not for him, for whoever came later, for whoever would be alive when the innermost ring reached its terminus. For us. And that is where the suppression starts to look like something other than institutional embarrassment. Because if you are a man in 1843, and you have just pulled an object from the earth that appears to have been placed there specifically for people who have not yet been born, the rational response is not excitement. The rational response is the response he had. 11 days of silence followed by a deliberate choice to close the door and walk away from it. Because there are questions you can live with, and questions you cannot. And the question of whether someone in the deep past already knew how your civilization's story goes is not a question you can put back in the ground once you have asked it. So, you do the next best thing. You stop writing. You let the newspaper print its correction. You fill the clay impression with fresh clay from another part of the site. You make the ground look undisturbed, and you tell yourself that it has gone to proper hands, and you do not ask what that means, and neither does anyone else. The pattern has repeated itself across every subsequent encounter with this object and its documentation. Find record, partially suppress, quietly move, silence, and then more silence, calibrated and maintained across generations by people following a habit so deeply embedded that most of them probably did not know they were following it. The silence was deafening, and I mean that precisely. It is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of people who have understood something and chosen not to say it out loud. That is a specific kind of quiet, and it has a specific shape. And once you learn to recognize the shape, you find it everywhere this object has left a trace. Here is what I cannot resolve, and I want to be honest about that rather than offering you a clean conclusion that the evidence does not support. I do not know whether the terminus is a prediction or a memory. I do not know whether whoever built the Ohio wheel was looking forward through time or backward across it. I do not know whether 2030 marks the approach of something, the return of something, or something else entirely for which I do not have the right word yet because the framework that would produce that word was buried in an Ohio drainage trench in 1843 and has not been recovered. What I do know is that the object exists or existed, and that the response to its existence has been consistent and deliberate across nearly 2 centuries. What I do know is that a calendar built to terminate is not the same thing as a calendar built to measure. What I do know is that the question of prediction versus memory is not an academic distinction. It is the entire question. Because if it is a memory, then somewhere in whatever came before us, before the history we have access to, before the record that survived, something happened in this window of years that was significant enough to be encoded in stone and hidden in the earth and aimed at us like a letter with a very long delivery time. And I do not know how to sit with that comfortably. I am not sure we are meant to. I keep returning to what the worker wrote, decades later, in his reminiscence about the canal project. He was instructed to fill the clay impression with fresh clay to make the ground look undisturbed. He was told the object had gone to proper hands. He recalled that no one asked questions. The ease of that silence, 60 years after the fact, from a man old enough to have outlived any official consequence, is the detail that stays with me. He was not frightened. He was not angry. He simply reported it as a thing that happened, a decision that was made, a door that was closed, as if the closing of it were the most natural thing in the world, as if perhaps he had understood, in some inarticulate way, that certain findings are not meant to be findings at all. They are meant to be questions, patient questions, sealed in clay, waiting for the people who will be alive when the wheel stops turning. We are those people. The question is addressed to us. And whatever it means that we are here at this particular moment, in whatever cycle the builders understood and we have forgotten, the worst thing we can do is what every generation before us has done. Look at it, recognize the shape of what it is asking, and walk away without an answer. Because the object was not placed in the earth to be suppressed. It was placed there to be found. It was placed there by people who knew it would be found, and who knew approximately when, and who trusted whoever arrived at that moment to be the kind of people willing to ask the question be all the way to the end. I do not know if we are those people, but I think we are being asked to find out.